I'm Emily Thompson, 29 years old, and until 6 months ago, I believed that love meant making yourself smaller so others could shine brighter. That belief nearly destroyed me. But this story isn't about destruction. It's about the moment everything shattered so completely that I had no choice but to rebuild from the ground up. The morning of March 15th started like any ordinary Friday. I woke up in my cramped studio apartment in Queens at 6:30 a.m. The same time, my phone alarm had been going off for the past 4 years. The space was barely 400 square feet, with a Murphy bed that doubled as my dining table and a kitchenette that could charitably be called cozy. The rent ate up nearly half my monthly salary from Sterling Creative, but it was mine, the first place I'd ever lived that my parents hadn't helped pay for. I made coffee in my tiny French press, the same ritualistic movements that grounded me every morning. Strong, black, no sugar. I'd developed a taste for bitter things over the years. As the coffee steeped, I stood at my single window, looking out at the brick wall of the building next door. Not much of a view, but the morning light that filtered through was enough to remind me that each day was a fresh start. My reflection in the window showed a woman who looked older than her 29 years. Auburn hair that I'd been dyeing darker lately to look more professional. Green eyes that my high school boyfriend once said reminded him of sea glass. And a face that was pleasant enough, but forgettable in crowds. I'd inherited my father's sturdy build and practical features rather than my mother's delicate bone structure that Rachel had claimed as her birthright. The commute to Manhattan took an hour on the subway, squeezed between commuters who all seemed to know where they were going with more certainty than I felt about my own life. I used the time to review my presentation for the Morrison Industries account, a project I'd been leading for 3 months that had the potential to be Sterling Creative's biggest client acquisition of the year. Sterling Creative occupied 3 floors of a converted warehouse in Midtown, all exposed brick and industrial lighting that was supposed to convey authentic urban creativity. The company handled branding and digital campaigns for mid-tier clients who couldn't afford the big Madison Avenue agencies, but wanted more sophistication than their nephew's design business could provide. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady, and I'd learned to find satisfaction in solving visual problems and crafting coherent brand narratives. My desk was in the corner of the open floor plan, positioned so I could see everyone coming and going, a strategic choice for someone who preferred to observe rather than perform. The space was cluttered with concept boards, color swatches, and half-empty coffee cups that I forgot to wash. My computer had 2 monitors, which felt luxurious compared to the single screen I'd started with as a junior designer 4 years ago. Michael Reeves, my boss and the agency's creative director, stopped by my desk around 10 a.m. with his usual Friday morning energy, part caffeine, part genuine enthusiasm for the work that had kept him passionate about advertising for 15 years. Emily, the Morrison presentation is today at 2 p.m., right? Michael was in his mid-40s, with graying temples that he'd stopped trying to hide and wire-rimmed glasses that made him look professorial. He'd been my mentor since I started at Sterling, seeing potential in me that I was still learning to recognize in myself. Yes, all set, I replied, pulling up the presentation on my screen. I've got 3 concept directions, complete brand architecture, and preliminary digital campaign mock-ups. Beautiful work, as always, he said, leaning over my shoulder to review the slides. This is exactly the kind of strategic thinking Morrison needs. If we land this account, I'm recommending you for promotion to assistant creative director. My heart jumped at the mention of promotion, but I tried to keep my expression neutral. I had learned not to get too excited about possibilities until they became realities. That would be incredible, Michael. Thank you for believing in me. You've earned it, M. Your work speaks for itself. The Morrison presentation went better than I could have hoped. James Morrison, the CEO of a mid-sized manufacturing company looking to rebrand for younger consumers, responded enthusiastically to my concepts. He asked intelligent questions about implementation timelines and budget allocation, treating me as the strategic partner I'd worked years to become rather than just the person who made things look pretty. This is exactly the direction we need to go, Morrison said as we wrapped up the meeting. When can we start? Michael and I exchanged glances. Landing a client during the initial presentation was unusual. Most companies wanted time to consider and compare proposals. We can have contracts ready by Monday and begin discovery the following week, Michael replied smoothly. As Morrison's team gathered their materials to leave, he turned back to me. Miss Thompson, I want you to know that your understanding of our brand challenges really impressed me. I look forward to working with you directly on this project. After they left, Michael closed the conference room door and grinned at me. That was exceptional work, Emily. Morrison was completely sold, not just on the concepts, but on you as the lead strategist. I can hardly believe it, I admitted, feeling a mixture of elation and disbelief. Believe it, Michael said firmly. Which brings me to something else. The promotion I mentioned? It's not just a possibility anymore. HR approved the position this morning. Senior management wants to offer you assistant creative director, effective immediately, with a salary increase to $78,000. The number hit me like a physical sensation. I'd been making $52,000 for the past 2 years, respectable for New York, but hardly comfortable. The raise would change everything. A better apartment, financial security, the ability to save for the future instead of just surviving month to month. Michael, I don't know what to say. Say you'll accept, he laughed. You've more than earned this, Em. Your strategic thinking, client relationship skills, and creative vision are exactly what we need as we grow. I accepted, of course, trying to maintain professional composure while internally celebrating. As Michael left to start the paperwork, I sat alone in the conference room, looking out at the Manhattan skyline and feeling something I hadn't experienced in years, genuine pride in my accomplishments. My first instinct was to call my parents and share the news, but I hesitated. Past experience had taught me that my professional victories were often met with polite acknowledgement rather than celebration. Instead, I texted my college roommate Sarah, who lived in Portland and would appreciate the significance of this career milestone. Asterisk huge news, got promoted to assistant creative director with a $26,000 raise. Still processing that it's real, asterisk. Her response was immediate, asterisk OMG Emily. This is amazing. You've worked so hard for this. Celebration drinks when I visit next month. Asterisk the enthusiasm in her message made me smile. Sarah had known me during the worst of my college years, when I'd struggled with anxiety and self-doubt, working multiple part-time jobs while maintaining a 3.8 GPA. She understood what this promotion meant on a personal level, not just professionally. That afternoon, as I walked through Midtown after work, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of taking the subway directly home, I turned down Fifth Avenue toward the gallery district. I'd been walking past the same galleries for 4 years, always as an observer looking through windows at a world that seemed close to me. But today felt different. Today, I was Assistant Creative Director Emily Thompson, with a salary that could support more than just survival. Today, I could walk into Meridian Art Gallery not as an interloper, but as a legitimate customer. The decision to buy art wasn't entirely spontaneous. For months, I'd been saving small amounts, $1.50 here, $100 there, in a separate account I'd labeled Someday Fund. I told myself it was for emergencies, but really it was for this, the someday when I felt worthy of beautiful things. The promotion had crystallized something I'd been avoiding acknowledging. I'd spent so many years focused on not being a burden that I'd forgotten how to be a person with desires and dreams. I worked hard, paid my bills, visited my family dutifully, and asked for nothing. It was a safe way to live, but not a fulfilling one. As I stood outside Meridian Gallery that evening, looking at the elegant displays through floor-to-ceiling windows, I made myself a promise. I would stop waiting for permission to want things. I would stop shrinking to make others comfortable. I would buy something beautiful because I had earned it and because beauty mattered. The gallery would be open until 8 p.m. on Friday nights for their weekly artist reception. I had time to go home, change into something appropriate, and return as the person I was becoming rather than the person I had been. My studio apartment had never felt smaller than it did that Friday evening as I stood in front of my tiny closet, trying to decide what one wore to buy their first piece of real art. The options were limited. Work clothes that made me look confident but uninspiring, casual clothes that suggested I couldn't afford to be there, or the single dress I'd bought for my college graduation and worn to every important occasion since. I chose the charcoal dress, a classic A-line in wool crepe that skinned my knees and had clean, sophisticated lines. It was 4 years old but well made, the kind of investment piece that transcended trends. I paired it with my grandmother's pearl earrings, the only jewelry I own that suggested good taste rather than economic necessity. Standing in my bathroom mirror, applying makeup with the same precision I brought to design concepts, I studied my reflection. The woman looking back at me was someone I was still getting to know, professional, purposeful, ready to take up space in the world. I'd inherited my father's pragmatic features and my mother's careful attention to grooming, resulting in an appearance that was pleasant if unremarkable. My auburn hair, which I'd recently started wearing in a sleek bob instead of the long, apologetic style of my 20s, framed a face that looked serious in repose, but transformed when I smiled genuinely. The subway ride back to Manhattan felt different than my morning commute. Instead of the resigned shuffle of another workday, I sat straighter, watched my reflection in the dark windows, and allowed myself to feel excited. This was what agency felt like, making choices based on desire rather than obligation. Meridian Art Gallery occupied the ground floor of a converted brownstone on East 67th Street, its presence announced by underlit signage and the warm glow of carefully positioned spotlights. Through the windows, I could see small clusters of people moving between displays, wine glasses in hand, speaking in the hushed tones that galleries seemed to inspire. I pushed open the heavy glass door and was immediately enveloped by the atmosphere of curated sophistication, polished concrete floors, white walls that showcased rotating exhibitions, and the subtle scent of expensive candles that somehow made the space feel both contemporary and timeless. A woman approached me almost immediately, tall, elegant, with silver-streaked black hair pulled back in a perfect chignon. Her black dress was simple but clearly expensive, and she moved with the confidence of someone completely comfortable in her environment. Good evening and welcome to Meridian. I'm Sophia Castellanos, the gallery director. Are you here for the reception, or may I help you find something specific? Her accent carried traces of something European, Spanish or Italian perhaps, and her manner was warm without being pushy. I had expected to feel intimidated, but her genuine smile put me at ease. Actually, I'm interested in purchasing something, I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. It would be my first serious art acquisition, so I'm hoping you might guide me toward pieces that would be appropriate for a collector just starting out. Sophia's eyes lit up with genuine enthusiasm. Your first piece, how wonderful. There's nothing quite like that initial acquisition. It establishes your aesthetic vision and often influences everything you choose afterward. Do you have preferences in terms of medium, size, or artistic movement? I'd done enough research to have opinions. I'm drawn to contemporary work, particularly glass sculptures and abstract paintings. Something substantial enough to anchor a room, but not so large it overwhelms a smaller space. Excellent parameters. Sophia nodded approvingly. Let me show you several pieces that might speak to you. She led me away from the reception crowd toward a quieter section of the gallery, where individual pieces were displayed with generous spacing that allowed each work to command attention. As we walked, Sophia explained the gallery's curatorial philosophy. They focused on emerging and mid-career artists whose work demonstrated both technical excellence and conceptual depth. This piece has been generating quite a bit of interest, she said, stopping before a stunning glass sculpture that seemed to capture light and refract it into prismatic rainbows. It's by Marcus Chin, a contemporary artist who's been experimenting with combining traditional glassblowing techniques with modern geometric forms. The sculpture stood about 18 inches tall on a simple pedestal, its surfaces cut and polished to create an interplay of transparency and reflection. Depending on the viewing angle, It appeared to be one solid form or multiple interconnected elements, creating an optical illusion that was both sophisticated and playful. It's beautiful, I breathed, moving around the piece to see how the light changed with each perspective. Marcus trained at Murano in Italy before developing his own aesthetic vocabulary, Sophia continued. This piece is part of a series exploring the relationship between structure and fluidity, how something can appear solid and ephemeral simultaneously. The description resonated with me on a personal level. Wasn't that exactly how I felt about my own life lately? Solid in some ways, fluid in others, constantly shifting depending on perspective. What's the price point? I asked, trying to sound casual despite my racing heart. This piece is $3,200, Sophia replied without hesitation. It includes a certificate of authenticity and detailed provenance documentation. The number was substantial, but not impossible. With my promotion and the money I'd saved, it was within reach. Not comfortable, but achievable. More importantly, it felt right in a way that few purchases in my life ever had. I'd like to think about it, I said, though I was already certain of my decision. Could you hold it for me until tomorrow? Of course, Sophia smiled. Take my card and call when you've decided. Though I should mention, there's been some interest from other collectors, so I wouldn't wait too long. As I studied the sculpture from different angles, memorizing the way it transformed light into something magical, Sophia excused herself to greet other visitors. I stood alone with the piece, feeling a sense of connection that was both unexpected and profound. This wasn't just about buying art, it was about claiming my right to surround myself with beauty. For too many years, I'd prioritized everyone else's needs over my own desires, convincing myself that wanting beautiful things was shallow or selfish. But standing there, seeing how the sculpture seemed to pulse with its own internal light, I understood that beauty wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity for the soul. The reception was winding down, and the gallery was beginning to empty when I finally decided to leave. I had Sophia's card in my purse and a decision crystallizing in my heart. I would buy the sculpture, not because I needed it, but because I wanted it, and for the first time in my adult life, that felt like reason enough. Walking back to the subway, I felt lighter than I had in months. The promotion at work had been validation of my professional competence, but this decision to buy art was something deeper, recognition of my own worthiness to have desires and act on them. I called Sarah from the subway platform while waiting for my train. You're going to think I'm crazy, I began when she answered. I doubt it. What's up? I'm about to spend $3,200 on a glass sculpture. Silence for a moment. Then, Emily Thompson, responsible financial planner and queen of practical decisions, is buying expensive art? The new and improved Emily Thompson is, I confirmed. The one with the promotion and the raise who's tired of living like a monk. I love this version of you, Sarah said, and I could hear the grin in her voice. Tell me everything about it. As the train carried me back to Queens, I described the sculpture, the gallery, and the feeling of walking through that space as someone who belonged there. Sarah listened with the enthusiasm of a true friend, asking detailed questions and celebrating this small rebellion against my historically cautious nature. You know what this is, right? She said as our conversation wound down. Expensive? I suggested. Evolution, she corrected. You're finally letting yourself have nice things. I'm proud of you. That night, I lay in my Murphy bed looking up at the ceiling and planning where I would display my new sculpture. The purchase would require some financial juggling, eating out less, skipping my gym membership for a few months, being more careful with discretionary spending, but it was manageable. More importantly, it felt like the right decision in a way that transcended financial logic. I was buying more than art. I was buying permission to value beauty, to trust my own taste, to take up space in the world as someone with preferences and desires. The sculpture would be a daily reminder that I was worthy of beautiful things, not because of what I did for others or how small I made myself, but simply because I existed. It was a lesson I'd spent 29 years learning, and I was finally ready to put it into practice. As I drifted off to sleep, I was already composing the email I would send to Sophia first thing in the morning, confirming my purchase and arranging delivery. Tomorrow, I would own my first piece of real art, and with it, a new understanding of my place in the world. The phone call came at 6:23 a.m. on Saturday morning, jarring me awake with the particular urgency that only family calls at dawn can provide. My mother's voice was bright with the forced cheer she deployed for major announcements, and I knew immediately that something significant had happened in Rachel's life. Emily, darling, I hope I didn't wake you, but we have the most wonderful news. Your sister has something very special to tell you. I sat up in bed, instantly alert despite the early hour. In the Thompson family hierarchy, early morning calls meant one of three things: emergencies, deaths, or events deemed so momentous they couldn't wait for civilized hours. Given my mother's tone, I rolled out the first two options. Mom, it's not even 6:30. What's going on? Oh, you know how time flies when you're excited, she replied, though I could hear papers rustling in the background. My mother's tell that she was nervous or performing. Rachel wants to share her news herself, but I simply couldn't wait. Hold on, she's right here. There was a shuffle as the phone changed hands, and then Rachel's voice, breathy with excitement. Emily. Oh my God, you'll never guess what happened. Even half asleep, I could predict the answer. At 26, Rachel had been dating David Blackwood for exactly 4 months, a relationship timeline I knew precisely because she'd announced each weekly milestone with the precision of someone tracking an investment portfolio. Let me guess, I said, settling back against my pillows. David proposed? He did, she squealed, confirming my suspicion. Last night at Les Burner Den. Emily, the ring is absolutely gorgeous. 2 carats, princess cut, with a platinum setting that catches light from every angle. David had it custom designed at Tiffany's. The details came rapid fire, as they always did with Rachel's announcements. The restaurant, expensive and exclusive. The presentation, rose petals and a string quartet. The ring, substantial and from the right jeweler. The timeline, fall wedding at the Westchester Country Club. Every element carefully curated for maximum impression. That's wonderful, Rachel, I managed, genuinely trying to summon enthusiasm for my sister's happiness. Congratulations. Thank you. She paused for dramatic effect. You know, I wasn't sure if David was ready for such a big commitment so soon, but he said he'd never been more certain of anything in his life. Isn't that romantic? There was something in her tone that suggested she was seeking validation rather than sharing joy, a quality I'd learned to recognize in our conversations. Rachel's happiness often seemed to require an audience to confirm its legitimacy. My mother reclaimed the phone. We're having a celebration dinner tomorrow at 6 p.m. Your father is making a special lasagna, and David's parents might join us. I've already called your Aunt Margaret and Uncle Robert. Everyone is just thrilled. The speed of the family mobilization was typical for Rachel-centered events. When I'd graduated summa cum laude from college, we'd had cake from the grocery store bakery. When Rachel had finished her bachelor's degree, 2 years later than planned after changing majors 3 times, we'd hosted a dinner party for 20 people. That sounds lovely, I said, though internally I was calculating whether I could gracefully attend while still making it to Meridian Gallery during their Saturday hours. Oh, and Emily, my mother continued, could you pick up flowers on your way? Something cheerful for the centerpiece? I'm having the house clean this morning, and there's so much to coordinate. The automatic assignment of tasks was another family pattern. When celebrations were needed, Rachel was celebrated, and I was enlisted to help create the celebration. I'd long ago stopped pointing out the disparity. Of course, Mom. What time should I be there? 6 sharp, darling. And wear something nice. David's parents are very sophisticated people. After the call ended, I lay in bed for a few minutes processing the conversation. I was genuinely happy for Rachel. David seemed kind and patient, qualities that would serve him well as Rachel's husband. But the familiar dynamics were already asserting themselves. Rachel at the center of attention, family resources mobilizing around her needs, and me automatically assigned to the supporting cast. It wasn't malicious, I'd realized over the years. It was simply the established order of our family system, as natural and unquestioned as gravity. Rachel generated drama and excitement. I provided stability and support. Rachel needed things. I made sure she got them. It had always been this way. But something felt different this morning as I showered and prepared for the day. Maybe it was the promotion still fresh in my mind, or the anticipation of buying my first piece of art, but the familiar family patterns felt less inevitable than they had in the past. For the first time, I found myself wondering, what would happen if I prioritized my own desires with the same energy my family devoted to Rachel's? The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. I arrived at Meridian Gallery when it opened at 10 a.m., having spent the previous hour researching Marcus Chen's work online and confirming that $3,200 was a fair price for his sculptures. The morning light streaming through the gallery's windows made the piece look even more magnificent than it had the evening before, if such a thing were possible. Sophia greeted me with a knowing smile. "I had a feeling I'd see you this morning. Have you decided?" "I have," I replied, feeling my heart rate accelerate with the finality of the decision. "I'd like to purchase the Chin sculpture." "Wonderful choice," Sophia said warmly. "It's a piece that will grow with you over time." Collectors often tell me that their first acquisition remains special precisely because it represents the moment they decided to trust their own aesthetic judgment. The transaction took longer than I'd expected: paperwork for authenticity certificates, insurance documentation, and delivery arrangements. As Sophia processed my credit card for the largest non-essential purchase I'd ever made, I experienced a moment of vertigo at my own boldness. "Buyer's remorse?" Sophia asked gently, reading my expression. "No," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "The opposite, actually. I feel like I should have done this years ago." Sophia nodded approvingly. "That's the mark of the right piece at the right time. The sculpture will be delivered Monday afternoon. Do you have any questions about care and maintenance?" As she explained the proper way to clean and position the piece, I found myself thinking about where it would live in my small apartment. The space would need to be reorganized around the sculpture rather than squeezing it into existing arrangements. Another small but significant shift from accommodation to intentionality. I left the gallery with a receipt for $3,200 and a feeling of lightness that was entirely disproportionate to the weight of the financial commitment I'd just made. Walking up Fifth Avenue toward the subway, I passed couples arm in arm, families with strollers, tourists consulting maps, and for the first time in recent memory, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged in the world. The flower shop near my parents' house was busy with Saturday afternoon customers buying arrangements for dinner parties and weekend gatherings. I selected a mixed bouquet of pale pink roses and white hydrangeas, elegant without being ostentatious, celebratory without competing with the guest of honor. Driving through my childhood neighborhood in Westchester always triggered a complex mix of nostalgia and displacement. The tree-lined streets and well-maintained colonial houses represented stability and middle-class aspiration, but they also reminded me of feeling like a visitor in my own family home. The Thompson family house was a center hall colonial built in the 1960s, with 4 bedrooms, 2.5 bathrooms, and a kitchen that had been renovated once during my high school years. It wasn't grand by local standards, but it was solid and comfortable, the kind of home that suggested responsible financial planning and proper priorities. My parents had lived there for 32 years, raising 2 daughters and hosting countless family gatherings in the living room with its coordinated furniture and carefully maintained neutrality. Nothing in the house was beautiful simply for beauty's sake. Everything served a function or fulfilled an expectation of what a proper family home should contain. My mother answered the door wearing her entertaining outfit, navy slacks, and a pearl gray cashmere sweater that brought out the silver in her hair. At 58, Eleanor Thompson remained an attractive woman who took care of herself with the discipline she applied to all aspects of her life. "Emily, perfect timing," she said, accepting the flowers with distracted efficiency. "Rachel and David just arrived, and I was hoping you could help me set the table while I finish the salad." The automatic delegation was so familiar I almost didn't notice it, but something made me pause at the threshold. Actually, Mom, could I say hello to Rachel and David first? I'd like to congratulate them properly. A brief flicker of surprise crossed her features. Apparently, my usual immediate compliance with requests was expected rather than appreciated. Of course, dear. They're in the living room with your father. The living room was arranged for conversation, with furniture positioned to encourage group interaction rather than individual comfort. My father, Richard Thompson, sat in his usual chair by the window, wearing weekend clothes that were still somehow formal, khakis, and a button-down shirt that suggested he was ready for any emergency that might require looking respectable. At 61, he remained a commanding presence despite the gray hair and lines around his eyes. 35 years as a high school principal had given him an authority that extended into family situations, a way of managing conversations and expectations that kept things orderly even when emotions ran high. Rachel sat on the sofa beside David, positioned so that her left hand was prominently displayed. The engagement ring was indeed impressive, substantial without being vulgar, clearly expensive but in good taste. She'd chosen her outfit carefully for the occasion, a cream silk blouse and charcoal gray pants that made her look sophisticated and bridal without trying too hard. David Blackwood rose when I entered the room, extending his hand with the formal courtesy that had impressed my parents from his first visit. He was tall and lean, with prematurely gray hair that made him look distinguished rather than old, and wire-rimmed glasses that suggested intelligence without pretension. "Emily, congratulations on your promotion," he said warmly. "Rachel told me about your new position at Sterling Creative. Assistant Creative Director. That's a significant achievement." The fact that he'd remembered and mentioned my career milestone, despite the obvious focus on their engagement, was both surprising and touching. It suggested an attention to others' accomplishments that was rare in my family's usual dynamic. "Thank you, David. And congratulations to both of you." Rachel showed me the ring, and it's absolutely beautiful. "Isn't it?" Rachel extended her hand so the diamond caught the afternoon light streaming through the living room windows. David has exquisite taste. He spent months researching the perfect cut and setting. As she launched into the story of the proposal, every detail carefully preserved and presented for maximum impact, I found myself studying David's face. He listened to his fiancée's narrative with patient attention, occasionally adding details or corrections, but his expression suggested someone who was still processing the magnitude of what he'd committed to. Not doubt, exactly, but the slightly overwhelmed look of someone who'd been swept up in Rachel's enthusiasm and was now trying to catch up with the reality of what they'd initiated. "The wedding planning is going to be so much fun," Rachel continued, her energy building with each detail. "I've already called the Westchester Country Club to check availability for next October. David's family knows the event coordinator there, so we should be able to get the date we want." October was 7 months away, a timeline that seemed both rushed and entirely in character for Rachel, who approached major life decisions with the same impulsive energy she brought to smaller choices. "That's quite a timeline," I observed neutrally. "You'll have to move quickly on vendors and planning." "Oh, I've been thinking about wedding details for years," Rachel laughed. "I have binders full of ideas, flowers, dresses, invitations, everything. The only thing I was waiting for was the right person to marry." She looked at David with genuine affection, and he squeezed her hand with what appeared to be sincere emotion. Whatever concerns I might have about their timeline or compatibility, it was clear they cared for each other. My mother appeared in the doorway. "Emily, could I borrow you for just a moment? I need help with something in the kitchen." The request was coded language for a private conversation, so I followed her through the dining room into the kitchen, where she was arranging my flowers in a crystal vase that only appeared for special occasions. "What do you think of David?" she asked without preamble. "He seems very nice," I replied honestly. "Thoughtful and stable. He'll be good for Rachel." "That's what I think too," she nodded, adjusting the flower arrangement with unnecessary precision. "Your sister can be intense sometimes. She needs someone who won't be overwhelmed by her personality." It was the closest my mother had ever come to acknowledging Rachel's dramatic tendencies, and I wasn't sure how to respond to this rare moment of candor. Are you concerned about the timeline? I asked. 7 months is pretty quick for wedding planning. She sighed, a sound that contained years of experience managing Rachel's impulsive decisions. Your sister has never been one to do things gradually. When she wants something, she wants it immediately. At least this time, it's something positive. The this time reference hung in the air between us, a tacit acknowledgement of previous Rachel centered crises that had required family management and damage control. The important thing is that she's happy, I said, falling back on the diplomatic neutrality that had served me well in family situations. Yes, my mother agreed, but her tone suggested the same complex mix of love and exhaustion that I recognized in my own feelings about Rachel. She is happy, and David seems capable of managing her expectations. We finished setting the table in companionable silence, using the good china and crystal that marked this as an occasion worthy of ceremony. As I arranged place settings, I found myself wondering what it would be like to be the focus of such elaborate preparation, to have your happiness become the organizing principle around which the entire family mobilized. The thought was both appealing and slightly frightening. I'd spent so many years being the stable, reliable daughter that I wasn't sure how to be the celebrated, complicated one. Dinner proceeded with the ritualistic quality that marked all Thompson family gatherings, careful conversation that avoided controversial topics, predetermined roles that everyone fulfilled without discussion, and an underlying current of performance that suggested we were all conscious of being family rather than simply being together. David's presence elevated the usual dynamic slightly. As an outsider, he asked genuine questions about family history, work projects, and future plans, forcing us to explain ourselves in ways that revealed patterns we usually took for granted. Emily, Rachel mentioned you work in advertising, he said during the main course. What kind of accounts do you handle? Marketing and branding mostly, I replied. We help companies develop their visual identity and digital presence. I just landed a major manufacturing client that's looking to rebrand for younger consumers. That sounds fascinating, David said, his interest apparently genuine. What's your process for understanding a brand's authentic identity versus the image they want to project? It was a sophisticated question that demonstrated real understanding of marketing complexities, and I found myself giving a more detailed answer than I usually offered at family dinners. As I explained the strategic frameworks I use to analyze brand positioning, I noticed my parents listening with an attention they rarely gave to my work discussions. You make it sound like psychology, David observed when I finished. It is, in a way, I agreed. Understanding what motivates consumer behavior and then crafting messages that resonate with those deeper needs. Rachel, who had been quiet during this exchange, suddenly interjected, Emily always makes her job sound more important than it is. It's basically just making advertisements look pretty. The dismissal was delivered with a laugh, as if she were sharing an affectionate family joke rather than undermining my professional credibility in front of her fiancé. But David's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something that might have been disapproval crossing his features. Actually, he said carefully, Emily's description suggests quite a bit of strategic thinking and psychological insight. Brand development is becoming increasingly sophisticated. It was a gentle correction, but a correction nonetheless, and I felt a flush of gratitude for his implicit defense of my work. The moment passed quickly as conversation moved to wedding planning, but I found myself reassessing David's character based on that brief interaction. Anyone willing to advocate for my professional competence in the face of Rachel's casual dismissal was someone worth knowing better. As the evening wound down and David helped Rachel gather her things to leave, he approached me while she said goodbye to our parents. Emily, I wanted to mention, my law firm handles some marketing and branding work for our corporate clients. If you ever want to discuss potential collaboration or consulting opportunities, I'd be happy to make introductions. The offer was professional but personal, the kind of networking gesture that could lead to significant opportunities. More importantly, it suggested that David saw me as someone worth connecting with, independent of my role as Rachel's sister. That's very generous, I replied. I'd definitely be interested in learning more. Great, he smiled, pulling out his phone. Could I get your email? I'll send you some information about the kind of projects we handle. As we exchanged contact information, Rachel reappeared at his side, threading her arm through his with the possessive casualness of someone marking territory. "What are you two talking about?" she asked, her tone light, but with an undertone I recognized, the particular frequency of jealousy that Rachel deployed when she sensed attention drifting away from her. David was mentioning some potential consulting work. I replied evenly. "Professional networking." "Oh, how nice," she said, though her grip on David's arm tightened slightly. "We should probably head home, though. David has an early golf game tomorrow, don't you, honey?" He nodded agreeably, though I caught a brief flicker of something in his expression, perhaps recognition of the dynamic he was witnessing, or maybe just mild frustration at having his conversation cut short. As they gathered their coats and made final goodbyes, I found myself wondering how long it would take Rachel to realize that David's patient kindness extended to everyone, not just her. And more interestingly, how she would handle sharing his attention once they were married. After they left, my parents and I cleaned up the dinner dishes in the comfortable routine that had developed over years of family gatherings. My father washed, I dried, and my mother put everything away in its designated place. "David seems like a good influence on Rachel," my father observed as he handed me a dinner plate. "Study. He's very mature for his age," my mother added. 34, established in his career, ready for commitment. Rachel could use someone who helps her think things through. The conversation had a quality of relief, as if my parents were finally seeing a solution to the Rachel problem that had defined so much of our family energy for the past decade. Since graduating from college, Rachel had cycled through jobs, apartments, relationships, and life goals with exhausting frequency, always landing safely because she knew someone would catch her. "Are you worried about the wedding timeline?" I asked, voicing the concern that had been nagging at me throughout dinner. My parents exchanged a glance that conveyed volumes of unspoken communication. "Your sister has always known her own mind," my mother said diplomatically. "When she's certain about something, she moves quickly." "The question is whether David is prepared for how quickly Rachel moves," my father added with characteristic directness. "He strikes me as someone who makes careful decisions." It was an astute observation. David did seem like a planner, someone who researched options and considered consequences before committing. Rachel, by contrast, made decisions based on feeling and impulse, then expected reality to adapt to her choices. "Well," I said as I dried the last wine glass, "at least they'll have an interesting engagement period." My mother laughed despite herself. "That's one way to put it." As I prepared to leave, my mother walked me to the door, a gesture that usually signaled she had something to say privately. "Emily," she began, then paused as if organizing her thoughts. "I want you to know that we're very proud of your promotion. I may have gotten distracted with Rachel's news today, but your father and I are genuinely pleased about your career progress." The acknowledgement was unexpected and touching, partly because it was so rare for my professional achievements to receive focused attention from my parents. "Thank you, Mom. That means a lot." "You've always been so self-sufficient," she continued, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been regret. "Sometimes I think we take that for granted. We don't worry about you the way we worry about Rachel." It was the most direct recognition of the family dynamic that my mother had ever offered, and I wasn't sure how to respond. The truth was that their lack of worry had often felt like lack of interest, but I understood now that it might have been their way of showing respect for my competence. "I appreciate that you trust me to handle things," I said carefully. "Though it would be nice to be celebrated sometimes, not just relied upon." She nodded slowly, as if seeing a familiar situation from a new angle. "We'll try to do better with that." The drive home gave me time to process the evening's revelations. Rachel's engagement was significant not just as a life event, but as a potential shift in family dynamics that had remained stable for decades. With David as a buffer and focus for her energy, Rachel might require less constant management and attention from the rest of us. The thought was both liberating and slightly disorienting. What would my role in the family be if I wasn't needed as the reliable daughter who handled logistics and provided stability? What would it mean to be seen as someone with my own needs and desires rather than just as the person who helped meet everyone else's? These questions were still circulating in my mind when I arrived home to find a voicemail from Sophia at Meridian Gallery confirming Monday's delivery time for my sculpture. The mundane details of logistics and scheduling suddenly seemed profoundly important, evidence that I was creating a life that included beautiful things chosen for no reason other than my own pleasure. As I prepared for bed, I stood at my single window looking out at the brick wall that had been my view for 4 years. Soon, I would have a piece of art that transformed light into something magical, proof that I was capable of choosing beauty over practicality. The thought carried me into sleep with a sense of anticipation I hadn't felt in years. Tomorrow would be Sunday, a day for rest and reflection before the sculpture arrived to begin transforming my space and perhaps my sense of what was possible in my own life. Sunday mornings had developed their own rhythm over the years I'd lived alone. Coffee at 7, a long walk through the neighborhood to pick up the Times, then hours spent reading and planning the week ahead. It was a routine that prioritized solitude and reflection, a conscious counterbalance to the collaborative demands of my work life. But this particular Sunday morning felt different from the moment I opened my eyes. The anticipation of tomorrow's sculpture delivery created an undercurrent of excitement that made ordinary activities feel charged with possibility. Even the simple act of making coffee seemed part of a larger transformation that was beginning to unfold. As I walked to the newsstand 6 blocks from my apartment, I found myself noticing architectural details and design elements that had been invisible to me before. The way morning light fell across fire escapes, the geometric patterns created by shadows on sidewalks, the relationship between old brick buildings and newer glass construction. Was this what happened when you began to think of yourself as someone who valued aesthetics? Did consciousness of beauty make you see it everywhere, or had it always been there waiting for attention? The Times was thick with its usual Sunday sections, but I found myself drawn to the arts pages with new intensity. Reviews of gallery exhibitions, profiles of emerging artists, analysis of auction results, information that had seemed irrelevant to my life just weeks ago now felt like essential intelligence for someone beginning to build a collection. A small article about the contemporary art market caught my attention. First-time collectors navigate uncertain waters. The piece interviewed several people who had recently made their first significant art purchases, describing everything from buyer's remorse to the thrill of discovering unknown artists whose work spoke to them personally. One quote particularly resonated. I realized I'd been waiting for permission to want beautiful things, as if aesthetic pleasure were somehow frivolous. But buying my first piece taught me that surrounding yourself with work that moves you isn't shallow, it's essential. Art doesn't just decorate space, it transforms how you experience that space. The sentiment captured exactly what I'd been struggling to articulate about my decision to buy the Chin sculpture. It wasn't about status or investment potential. It was about claiming the right to live among things that elevated daily experience from mere function to something approaching joy. My phone rang as I was finishing the arts section, interrupting thoughts about whether I might eventually expand my collection beyond a single piece. The caller ID showed Rachel's number, which was unusual for a Sunday morning. Our family typically observed an informal moratorium on non-emergency calls before noon on weekends. Emily, are you busy? Rachel's voice carried a breathless quality that suggested either excitement or crisis. With her, the distinction was often academic. Just reading the paper. What's up? I need to talk to someone about wedding planning, and Mom is driving me crazy with her questions about guest lists and budgets. Can you meet for coffee? Please. The request was surprising on multiple levels. Rachel rarely sought my advice about personal matters, and when she did, it was usually to ask me to handle logistics rather than provide emotional support. But there was something in her voice, a note of genuine anxiety beneath the usual drama, that made me reconsider my planned quiet Sunday. Sure, I heard myself saying. Where do you want to meet? That place in Soho you mentioned once? The one with the good lattes. The reference was to a cafe I discovered during weekend explorations of galleries and design shops, a small space with excellent coffee and the kind of deliberately understated aesthetic that attracted creative professionals. I was surprised Rachel remembered my mentioning it, let alone wanted to venture into territory outside her usual Upper East Side comfort zone. Blue Bottle on Spring Street. I can be there in an hour. Perfect. And Emily? Thank you. I really need to talk to someone who isn't going to judge me. The vulnerability in her voice was so uncharacteristic that I found myself wondering what kind of pre wedding anxiety had prompted this unprecedented reach for sisterly support. An hour later, I found Rachel already seated at a corner table in the cafe, nervously shredding a napkin while staring out at the Sunday foot traffic on Spring Street. She'd dressed down for the neighborhood, jeans and a cashmere sweater instead of her usual polished professional attire, but even casual, she managed to look perfectly put together. You found it okay? I asked as I joined her, though clearly she had. GPS, she smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. I've already ordered for both of us lattes and those almond croissants you like. The gesture of ordering for me was typical Rachel, assuming preferences and making decisions, but the choice of items suggested she'd actually paid attention to things I'd mentioned enjoying. It was a small thing, but significant coming from someone who usually approached conversations as opportunities to discuss her own interests. So I said, settling into the chair across from her wedding planning crisis. Rachel laughed, a sound that contained more stress than humor. Is it that obvious? You're not usually one to seek advice, I observed gently. And you seem uncharacteristically worried about something. She was quiet for a moment, watching steam rise from her latte cup. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than usual. What if I'm making a mistake? The question hung between us, loaded with implications that neither of us immediately wanted to examine. Rachel's certainty about her choices was such a fundamental part of her personality that doubt seemed almost foreign to her nature. What kind of mistake? I asked carefully. The timeline, she said immediately, as if she'd been waiting for permission to voice the concern. 7 months from engagement to wedding. Everyone keeps telling me it's romantic and spontaneous, but what if it's just impulsive? I studied my sister's face, looking for clues about what had triggered this moment of self-reflection. Rachel was many things: dramatic, self-centered, demanding, but she wasn't typically introspective about her own decision-making process. What's making you question it now? I asked. She sighed, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her usual theatrical expressions of frustration. David mentioned yesterday that his parents think we should wait until next spring. Give ourselves more time to plan properly, get to know each other's families better, make sure we're compatible long term. What did you tell him? That his parents are being overly cautious. That when you know, you know. She paused, then added more quietly, but what if they're right? What if knowing someone for 4 months isn't enough to commit to forever? It was a remarkably mature question coming from Rachel, who historically had made major decisions based on immediate impulses and expected reality to accommodate her choices. Do you feel like you know David well enough to marry him? I asked instead of offering my own opinion. Rachel considered this, absently stirring her latte while she thought. I know he's kind and stable and successful. I know he makes me feel safe in a way I haven't experienced before. I know he loves me. But sometimes I feel like he's in love with the version of me I become when we're together. The calmer, less dramatic version. What happens when he sees all of me, the parts that aren't so easy to love? The insight was surprisingly sophisticated, suggesting Rachel had more self-awareness about her own patterns than I'd given her credit for. Have you talked to him about this? I asked. How do you bring up, hey, what if you find out I'm actually exhausting and high maintenance, without sounding neurotic? Despite everything, I smiled at the characteristic Rachelness of the formulation. Maybe more like, I want to make sure we both understand what we're committing to. What concerns do you have about our relationship? God, you make it sound so reasonable, she laughed, but it was a Rael laugh this time. How do you always know the right thing to say? The question caught me off guard. I'd never thought of myself as particularly wise about relationships, quite the opposite, given my own romantic history of careful men who never quite committed and safe choices that never quite satisfied. I think it's easier to see clearly when you're not the one in the middle of it, I said. You're scared, which is normal. The question is whether you're scared of marriage in general or marriage to David specifically. Rachel was quiet for several minutes, absently breaking pieces off her croissant while she considered the distinction. Marriage to David, she said finally. I want to marry him. I'm just terrified I'm going to mess it up. How would you mess it up? By being too much, she replied immediately. By meeting too much attention, getting bored with routine, creating drama when things are going well. All the things that have ended my other relationships. The self assessment was brutally honest and more perceptive than anything I'd heard Rachel say about herself before. It suggested she'd spent more time analyzing her own patterns than I'd realized. Have you done those things with David so far? Not yet, she admitted. But we've only been together 4 months, and most of that has been the honeymoon phase. What happens when things get ordinary? It was a question that got to the heart of Rachel's fundamental challenge, her need for constant stimulation and drama, and her fear that ordinary happiness wouldn't be enough to sustain her interest. Maybe the fact that you're asking these questions is a sign that you're ready to work on changing those patterns, I suggested. Self-awareness is the first step toward growth. Do you really think I can change? The question was asked with such vulnerable sincerity that I felt a surge of protective affection for my complicated sister. I think you can learn to channel your energy in healthier ways, I said carefully. The question is whether you want it badly enough to do the work. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the Sunday afternoon foot traffic through the cafe's large windows. Soho attracted an interesting mix of people: tourists with shopping bags, artists with portfolios, couples strolling hand in hand, families with children who pointed excitedly at interesting architectural details. You know what's weird? Rachel said eventually. What? This is the longest conversation we've had in years where we've actually talked about something real. She was right. Our typical interactions followed predictable scripts, Rachel announcing her latest life development, me providing appropriate responses, both of us performing our established family roles without genuine engagement. Maybe we should do it more often, I suggested. I'd like that, she said, and seemed to mean it. I've been thinking lately that I don't really know you as a person. I know you as my responsible older sister who handles things, but not as Emily who has her own dreams and problems. The observation was more insightful than I'd expected from Rachel, who had historically shown little curiosity about other people's internal experiences. What would you like to know? I asked, curious about what she might be genuinely interested in learning. Everything, she said with characteristic intensity. Your job, your apartment, what you do for fun, whether you're dating anyone, what makes you happy. I realized yesterday that I couldn't answer basic questions about your life. What prompted this realization? David asked about you after we left dinner, and I realized I had nothing interesting to say. He knows more about your career after one conversation than I do after 29 years of being your sister. The admission was both embarrassing and touching, acknowledgement of how superficial our relationship had become, but also evidence that Rachel was capable of recognizing and wanting to change established patterns. Well, I said, I'm buying my first piece of art tomorrow. A glass sculpture that's being delivered to my apartment. Rachel's eyes widened with genuine interest. Really? That's incredible. What made you decide to do that? As I described the sculpture and my decision to buy it, I watched Rachel's face transform with something I'd rarely seen there before: authentic curiosity about someone else's experience. She asked thoughtful questions about the artist, the gallery, and what had drawn me to that particular piece. $3,000, she repeated when I mentioned the price. Emily, that's substantial. It is, I agreed. But I got promoted, I've been saving, and I decided I was tired of living like beautiful things were for other people. Good for you, she said, and her tone carried genuine admiration. I spend that much on clothes without thinking twice, but I've never bought anything that was purely about surrounding myself with beauty. What do you spend money on? I asked, realizing I had no idea about Rachel's financial priorities or personal spending patterns. Experiences mostly. Restaurants, travel, spa weekends. Things that make me feel good in the moment. She paused thoughtfully. But nothing that lasts. Nothing that transforms the space I live in. We spent the next hour talking with an openness that was entirely new to our relationship. Rachel told me about her job at the art museum, work she actually enjoyed despite her tendency to describe it dismissively in family contexts. I shared details about my promotion and the challenges of managing creative teams. The conversation revealed how little we'd really known about each other despite growing up in the same house. Rachel's work involved more strategic thinking than I'd realized. My job required more interpersonal skills than she'd understood. We were both more complex and competent than our family roles had allowed us to demonstrate. As we prepared to leave, Rachel hesitated at the cafe door. Emily, can I ask you something else? Sure. Do you think I should postpone the wedding? Be honest. I considered the question carefully, weighing my genuine concern about their timeline against my respect for Rachel's autonomy and my recognition that she seemed to be approaching this decision with more thoughtfulness than usual. I think you should have the conversation with David that you've been avoiding, I said finally. Talk about your concerns, ask about his, figure out together what timeline makes sense for both of you. And if he wants to wait, then you'll have to decide what's more important, marrying David or getting married in October. She nodded slowly, as if the distinction hadn't occurred to her before. Those aren't the same thing, are they? No, I confirmed. They're really not. As we hugged goodbye on the sidewalk outside the cafe, I felt something shift in our dynamic. Not transformation exactly, patterns built over decades don't change in single conversations, but a crack in the established order that might allow something healthier to grow. Thank you for this, Rachel said, for listening without judging and for asking questions that made me think. Thank you for trusting me with a real conversation, I replied. And Rachel, whatever you decide about the timeline, you're not going to mess this up just by being yourself. The right person will love all of you, not just the easy parts. Walking home through the late afternoon sunshine, I found myself thinking about the unexpected intimacy of the conversation with Rachel. For the first time in years, I'd seen glimpses of the person she might be when she wasn't performing the role of the dramatic younger sister who needed constant attention and management. The timing felt significant. Just as I was beginning to claim more agency in my own life, Rachel was showing signs of developing the self-awareness necessary for genuine growth. Perhaps we could both evolve beyond the limiting roles our family had constructed around us. The thought carried me home with a sense of possibility that extended far beyond tomorrow's art delivery. Change was in the air, and for once, it felt like change we might both be ready to embrace. Monday morning arrived with the particular quality of light that promised spring was finally asserting itself over the lingering grip of winter. I woke before my alarm, unusual for someone who had trained herself to extract every possible minute of sleep from weekday mornings, but anticipation had rewired my internal clock. The sculpture would arrive between 2 and 4 p.m., according to Sophia's email confirmation. I'd taken the afternoon off from work to receive the delivery and spend time arranging my space around this new centerpiece, the first time I'd ever used vacation hours for something purely personal rather than family obligations or practical necessities. My morning routine felt ceremonial as I prepared for what would be one of the last days of my apartment existing in its current form. Coffee tasted richer, the view from my single window seemed less constrained, and even the familiar sounds of my neighbors preparing for their Monday felt like a soundtrack to transformation rather than just urban noise. At Sterling Creative, the energy was particularly focused as Michael and I prepared for our follow-up meeting with Morrison Industries. Landing the account had generated enthusiasm throughout the company, and several team members had approached me with congratulations and questions about my strategic approach. "You've become quite the celebrity around here," observed Janet Morrison, our account director, as I reviewed final presentation materials in the conference room. "It feels surreal," I admitted. 3 months ago, I was worried about making rent. Now I'm the lead strategist on our biggest account. That's how careers work sometimes, Janet smiled. Long periods of steady growth punctuated by moments when everything accelerates at once. The observation proved prophetic in ways I couldn't have anticipated. At 11:30 a.m., as I was fine-tuning demographic analysis for the Morrison campaign, my office phone rang with an external call. The receptionist's voice carried a note of excitement that immediately caught my attention. "Emily, there's an Alexander Sterling on the line for you. He says it's regarding a professional opportunity." For a moment, I couldn't process the information. Alexander Sterling, the billionaire tech entrepreneur who had intervened in my confrontation with Rachel at Meridian Gallery, was calling me at work? Put him through, I managed, my heart rate accelerating as I tried to imagine what professional opportunity could possibly involve me. Miss Thompson. The voice was unmistakably his confident, direct, with the particular tone of someone accustomed to being listened to carefully. Mr. Sterling, this is unexpected. I apologize for the cold call, he said, and I could hear genuine courtesy in his tone rather than the perfunctory politeness of someone making obligatory contact. I've been thinking about our conversation at the cafe, particularly your work in visual storytelling and brand identity. I had mentioned my specialization during our coffee, but the idea that he'd remembered it, let alone considered it seriously enough to initiate contact, seemed almost impossible to believe. I'm flattered that you remember, I replied carefully. I remember quite clearly. You demonstrated strategic thinking and creative intelligence that impressed me. He paused, then continued. Sterling Dynamics is launching a new consumer security platform, and our marketing team needs someone with expertise in translating complex technical concepts into compelling visual narratives. Would you be interested in discussing this opportunity? The question hung in the air while I processed its implications. Sterling Dynamics was one of the most innovative technology companies in the world, known for both breakthrough products and exceptional work culture. An opportunity there would represent a quantum leap in my career trajectory. I would be very interested in learning more, I said, trying to match his professional tone while internally marveling at the surreal nature of the conversation. Excellent. Are you available for lunch tomorrow? I'd like to introduce you to Sarah Chin, our creative director, and discuss the position in more detail. We arranged to meet at a restaurant in Midtown, and after confirming the details, Alexander's tone became slightly more personal. Miss Thompson, Emily, I want to be clear that this opportunity is based entirely on your professional qualifications. Our conversation at the cafe demonstrated exactly the kind of strategic creative thinking we need. The circumstances of our meeting were unusual, but your capabilities are what prompted this call. The clarification was both reassuring and unnecessary. Even in my shock at receiving the call, it hadn't occurred to me to question whether the opportunity was legitimate. Something in Alexander Sterling's manner had conveyed absolute professional integrity. After ending the call, I sat in my office trying to absorb what had just happened. A chance encounter at an art gallery had led to an interview at one of the most prestigious technology companies in the world. The sequence of events was so improbable it felt like fiction. But as I reviewed what I knew about Sterling Dynamics' marketing challenges and considered how my experience might apply to their needs, the professional logic became clear. They were expanding into consumer markets after years of focusing on enterprise solutions, which required exactly the kind of brand translation work I'd been developing at Sterling Creative. The timing felt cosmically significant. My sculpture would arrive this afternoon, marking my first major personal investment in beauty and quality. Tomorrow, I might interview for a position that could transform my professional trajectory. Change was accumulating at a pace that felt both exhilarating and slightly overwhelming. Michael appeared in my office doorway around noon, carrying the particular expression that suggested he'd heard about the phone call through the office information network that seemed to operate independently of official channels. So he said, settling into the chair across from my desk with studied casualness, I hear you got an interesting call this morning. News travels fast around here, I observed. Sterling Dynamics, he continued, his tone mixing professional curiosity with personal concern. That's not a company that calls people randomly. No, I agreed. It's not. Michael was quiet for a moment, processing implications. Are you planning to pursue it? The question forced me to articulate something I'd been avoiding consciously acknowledging. Yes, absolutely, I was planning to pursue it, regardless of what it might mean for my position at Sterling Creative. I'm having lunch with them tomorrow, I said carefully. It seems like an opportunity worth exploring. Of course it is, Michael nodded, though I could see the disappointment he was trying to hide. You'd be crazy not to at least listen to what they're offering. Michael, I want you to know, Emily, he interrupted gently, you don't owe me explanations or apologies. You've earned whatever opportunities come your way. I just hope that if they make you an offer, you'll give us a chance to counter it. The conversation was both touching and complicated. Michael had been a genuine mentor and advocate, creating space for me to develop skills and take on responsibilities that had prepared me for exactly this kind of opportunity. But Sterling Dynamics operated at a level that Sterling Creative simply couldn't match in terms of resources, scope, or compensation. I will, I promised, meaning it while also knowing that any counteroffer would likely be academic given the scale of difference between the two companies. The rest of the workday passed in a blur of routine tasks performed while part of my attention remained focused on the extraordinary developments that seemed to be reshaping my life in real time. I found it difficult to concentrate on Morrison Industries' branding challenges when potentially life-changing conversations were scheduled for the next 24 hours. At 1:30 p.m., I left the office and headed home to prepare for the sculpture delivery. The subway ride to Queens felt different than usual, not the weary journey of someone returning to a space that represented compromise and limitation, but the anticipatory transit of someone about to transform their environment into something that reflected their actual values and aspirations. My apartment looked smaller than usual as I cleared space near the window where the sculpture would live. Moving furniture and rearranging existing objects to accommodate something beautiful felt like a practical meditation on priorities and possibilities. At exactly 2:15 p.m., Sophia arrived personally to oversee the delivery, accompanied by two professional art handlers who treated the sculpture with the reverence due a significant work. Watching them carefully unwrap and position the piece in the space I'd prepared was like witnessing the materialization of a decision that had felt almost abstract until this moment. Perfect placement, Sophia approved as the handlers made final adjustments to capture the optimal afternoon light. The piece will transform throughout the day as the sun moves. You'll discover new aspects of it constantly. She was right. Even in the few minutes since installation, I could see how the sculpture's surfaces caught and refracted light differently as clouds moved across the sky outside my window. It was like having a living, breathing presence in the room, constant but never static. After Sophia and the handlers left, I sat in my single chair and studied my transformed living space. The sculpture commanded attention without overwhelming the modest dimensions of the apartment. Its presence elevated everything around it, making my simple furniture and minimal decorations appear intentionally understated rather than economically constrained. More importantly, it changed how I felt in the space. The apartment was no longer just a place to sleep and eat between work and family obligations. It had become somewhere worth being, a reflection of my developing sense of myself as someone with aesthetic preferences and the means to honor them. I called Sarah in Portland to share both pieces of news, the sculpture delivery and the Sterling Dynamics interview. Wait, back up. She interrupted when I mentioned the interview. Alexander Sterling called you at work? The same Alexander Sterling who intervened when Rachel slapped you. The same, I confirmed, still hardly believing it myself. Emily, do you understand what this means? Sterling Dynamics is like the Google of security technology. People don't just get interviews there. They get recruited after years of building reputations in the industry. Her excitement was infectious and helped me begin to process the magnitude of what was happening. I'd been so focused on the immediate logistics, where to meet, what to wear, how to prepare, that I hadn't fully absorbed the career implications. What if I'm not qualified for whatever position they have in mind? I asked, voicing the anxiety that had been building throughout the day. Then they wouldn't have called, Sarah replied with characteristic directness. Alexander Sterling didn't become a billionaire by wasting time on unqualified candidates. He saw something in you that convinced him you could contribute to his company. After ending the call, I spent the evening researching Sterling Dynamics' recent product launches, marketing campaigns, and strategic direction. The company had indeed been transitioning from enterprise-focused security solutions to consumer products that required sophisticated brand development and user experience design. My background in translating complex business concepts into accessible visual narratives was directly relevant to their expansion goals. The more I learned about their challenges, the more confident I became that I could contribute meaningfully to their objectives. As darkness fell and my sculpture began to catch light from the apartment's interior fixtures rather than the window, I reflected on the remarkable acceleration of change that had begun just days ago. Friday morning, I had been Emily Thompson, competent but unexceptional marketing professional. By Monday evening, I was Emily Thompson, owner of significant art and candidate for a position at one of the world's most innovative companies. The sculpture seemed to pulse with its own inner light as I prepared for bed, a beautiful reminder that transformation was not only possible, but actively happening. Tomorrow would bring another opportunity to expand my sense of what was achievable, another chance to step into a larger version of myself. I fell asleep looking at the play of light and shadow the sculpture cast on my ceiling, anticipating the morning with a mixture of nervousness and excitement that felt entirely appropriate for someone whose life was reshaping itself in ways she was only beginning to understand. I woke at 5:30 a.m. on Tuesday morning without an alarm, my internal clock apparently recalibrated by anticipation. The sculpture caught the early dawn light streaming through my window, casting prismatic patterns across the opposite wall that seemed to shift and dance with my breathing. The symbolism wasn't lost on me as I made coffee and prepared for what could be the most significant professional opportunity of my life. The art I'd chosen was already transforming my daily experience, reminding me that I was someone who valued beauty and had the means to acquire it. Selecting an outfit required more consideration than usual. Sterling Dynamics had a reputation for creative informality, but this was still an interview with the company's founder and creative director. I settled on a charcoal gray suit with clean lines, paired with a silk blouse in deep blue, professional but not stuffy, polished without being overdone. The restaurant Alexander had chosen for our meeting was Le Bernardin, which immediately elevated my nervousness to an entirely new level. This wasn't coffee at a neighborhood cafe. This was lunch at one of Manhattan's most prestigious establishments, the kind of place where business decisions worth millions were made over expertly prepared fish courses. I arrived 15 minutes early and spent the time in the lobby studying other patrons, trying to absorb the atmosphere of refined competence that seemed to permeate spaces where powerful people conducted important business. Everyone moved with purpose and spoke in modulated tones that suggested comfort with environments where discretion and sophistication were assumed rather than performed. Alexander arrived precisely on time, dressed in a navy suit that somehow managed to look both expensive and understated. His handshake was firm but brief, and his manner carried the perfect balance of professional courtesy and personal warmth that I remembered from our previous encounters. "Emily, thank you for making time on such short notice," he said as we were seated at a corner table that afforded privacy for conversation. "Thank you for the opportunity," I replied. "I have to admit, I'm still processing that this is happening." He smiled, the kind of expression that suggested genuine amusement rather than polite acknowledgement. "I imagine it does feel somewhat surreal. Chance encounters don't typically lead to business opportunities at this level." A woman approached our table before I could respond, tall, elegant, with distinctive silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded immediate attention. Alexander rose to greet her, and I followed suit. "Emily Thompson, I'd like you to meet Catherine Sterling, my wife," he said. "Catherine, this is the Emily Thompson I mentioned." Catherine's handshake was warm and firm, her smile apparently genuine as she studied me with intelligent eyes. "It's lovely to meet you, Emily. Alexander has told me about your encounter at Meridian and your work in creative marketing." I felt a momentary flush of embarrassment at being identified as the woman who'd been slapped in public, but Catherine's manner contained no trace of pity or awkwardness. She seemed to view the incident as simply the circumstance that had led to more significant conversations. "It's an honor to meet you, Mrs. Sterling," I replied. "I've read about your work in sustainable technology development." "Please call me Catherine," she said as we all took our seats. "And yes, sustainability is one of my passions. But today I'm here." Catherine's presence added an unexpected dimension to what I'd anticipated would be a straightforward business meeting. As we settled into conversation, it became clear that her attendance wasn't ceremonial. She was genuinely interested in Sterling Dynamics' creative direction and my potential role in shaping it. "Emily," Catherine began, "Alexander mentioned your approach to translating complex technical concepts into accessible narratives. In your current work, how do you balance authenticity with simplification?" The question demonstrated sophisticated understanding of marketing challenges and suggested this wasn't a casual lunch, but a serious evaluation. I found myself speaking with more confidence than I'd expected, drawing on specific examples from my Morrison Industries work and other campaigns. As the meal progressed, our conversation evolved beyond interview questions into genuine strategic discussion. Alexander and Catherine posed scenarios about consumer security marketing, and I found myself thinking aloud about brand positioning and user psychology in ways that felt natural rather than performative. The challenge with security products, I observed during discussion of their new platform, is that effective security should be invisible to users. How do you market something whose greatest success is what doesn't happen? Catherine and Alexander exchanged a glance that suggested this insight had hit something they'd been struggling with. That's exactly the paradox we've been wrestling with, Alexander nodded. Our enterprise clients understand the value of preventing problems they never see. But consumers need more tangible benefits. By the time we reached coffee, the conversation had shifted from evaluation to collaboration. They were no longer interviewing me for a position. They were exploring how we might work together to solve genuine business challenges. Emily, Alexander said as our lunch concluded, I'd like to offer you the position of senior creative strategist, reporting directly to me, with a starting salary of $185,000 plus equity participation. The number hit me with physical force. It represented more than triple my current salary, enough to transform not just my lifestyle, but my fundamental relationship to money and possibility. There's no pressure to decide immediately, Catherine added, reading my expression accurately. This is a significant career transition, and we want you to be certain it's the right move. When would you need an answer? I managed to ask. Take a week, Alexander replied. Think about it. Discuss it with people whose judgment you trust. If you decide to accept, we can arrange for you to start in 3 weeks. Walking back to the Sterling creative office afterward, I felt disconnected from the familiar Midtown streets. The offer represented such a dramatic elevation in my professional circumstances that I struggled to process its reality. Michael was waiting in my office when I returned, his expression carefully neutral in the way that suggested he'd been rehearsing this conversation. How did it go? He asked. They offered me the position, I replied, settling behind my desk as if normal activities might help ground this surreal day. And I need to think about it. We sat in silence for a moment while I tried to organize thoughts that felt scattered by the magnitude of what had just occurred. Emily, Michael said finally, you know I can't match what they're offering. Neither in salary nor opportunity scope. I know, I replied quietly. And I'm grateful for everything you've done to prepare me for this kind of opportunity. Then take it, he said with characteristic directness. You've earned it, and frankly, you've outgrown what we can offer here. The generosity of his response, prioritizing my career development over Sterling Creative's interests, reminded me why he'd been such an effective mentor. That evening, I sat in my apartment with the sculpture catching light from my table lamp, trying to process the day's developments. In less than a week, I'd bought my first significant piece of art, received a job offer that would transform my financial situation, and begun to see myself as someone worthy of beautiful things and extraordinary opportunities. The phone rang as I was considering who to call first with the news. Rachel's name appeared on the display. Emily, I need to tell you something, she said without preamble when I answered. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. Actually, something's right. She paused, then continued in a rush. I talked to David about postponing the wedding. We're pushing it to next spring. How do you feel about that? Relieved, she admitted. Terrified that I'm making the right decision for the wrong reasons, but relieved. We both agreed that 7 months wasn't enough time to build the foundation for a lifetime commitment. The maturity of the decision impressed me, particularly coming from Rachel, who historically approached major life choices with impulsive certainty. I'm proud of you for having that conversation, I said. Thank you for helping me realize I needed to have it. She paused, then added, now tell me about your day. I have a feeling something significant happened. As I shared the details of the Sterling Dynamics interview and offer, I found myself describing not just the professional opportunity, but the personal transformation it represented. The shift from seeing myself as someone who accepted whatever circumstances arose to someone who actively shaped her own possibilities. Emily, Rachel said when I finished, "This is incredible. You're talking about your life like you're finally living it instead of just managing it." The observation captured something I'd been struggling to articulate. For years, I'd approached existence as a series of responsibilities to fulfill and problems to solve. But lately, starting with the decision to buy art and accelerating through the Sterling Dynamics opportunity, I'd begun to see life as something to be actively created rather than passively endured. 3 days later, after conversations with Sarah, my parents, and careful consideration of what this opportunity might mean for my future, I called Alexander Sterling to accept the position. "Welcome to Sterling Dynamics," he said, and I could hear genuine pleasure in his voice. "I think you're going to find this an interesting adventure." As I hung up the phone, I looked at my sculpture catching the afternoon light and realized that transformation, once begun, seemed to create its own momentum. Each decision to value myself and my desires had led to the next opportunity, creating a cascade of positive change that would have been impossible to predict or plan. The woman who had stood in Meridian Gallery just 2 weeks ago, hesitating to believe she deserved beautiful things, was becoming someone who not only deserved them, but had the means and confidence to acquire them. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Your father and I are proud of you, Emily. We're sorry it took us so long to celebrate your achievements properly." Looking out my window at the city that was about to offer me entirely new possibilities, I smiled. Change was happening faster than I'd ever imagined possible, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt ready to embrace it completely. Some transformations happen gradually over years of slow growth and careful progress. But sometimes, when the moment is right and courage finally aligns with opportunity, everything can shift in an instant, like light hitting glass at just the right angle, creating something brilliant and new from what had always been there, waiting to be revealed. The Sterling Dynamics office occupied 3 floors of a converted warehouse in Chelsea, all exposed brick and industrial lighting that managed to feel both sophisticated and creative. My office had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson River, and I'd positioned my Marcuston sculpture where it could catch both morning and afternoon light. The work was everything Alexander had promised, challenging, meaningful, and aligned with my strengths in ways that made even difficult days feel rewarding. The consumer security platform we'd launched had exceeded sales projections by 40%, and the brand positioning strategy I developed was being adapted for Sterling Dynamics' entire product line. Rachel's postponed wedding was scheduled for the following spring, and her relationship with David had deepened in ways that surprised even her. She'd started therapy to work on the patterns she'd identified during our Soho Cafe conversation, and David had proved capable of loving all of her, not just the easy parts. My apartment had been transformed by the addition of 2 more pieces: a small painting by an emerging Brooklyn artist and a ceramic sculpture by a woman whose work I discovered at an art fair in the Armory. The space felt like home in ways it never had before, a reflection of someone who valued beauty and had created a life worthy of it. But perhaps the most significant change was internal: the shift from seeing myself as someone who accommodated the world to someone who actively shaped it. I'd learned that transformation wasn't about becoming a different person. It was about becoming more fully yourself, without apology or limitation. Standing at my office window on a bright October morning, watching light dance across the water, I reflected on how quickly life could change when you finally gave yourself permission to want more than just survival. Sometimes the most important decision is not what you choose to do, but what you choose to stop accepting. The intercom on my desk buzzed with Alexander's voice. "Emily, could you join me in the conference room? There's someone I'd like you to meet about our European expansion." I smiled, straightened my shoulders, and walked toward whatever opportunity was waiting. After all, I was someone who deserved beautiful things and extraordinary possibilities, and finally, I knew it. I'm really curious about your thoughts on a few key moments in this story. What did you think of Emily's decision to spend $3,200 on the sculpture? Was it a wise investment in herself, or was it reckless spending? Have you ever made a purchase that felt transformative rather than just transactional? How do you feel about Rachel postponing her wedding? Do you think she made the right choice, or should she have trusted her initial instincts about marrying David quickly? The family dynamics between Emily and Rachel were pretty complex, Emily always being the responsible one while Rachel got most of the attention. Can you relate to either of their positions? How do you think birth order affects family roles? Alexander Sterling's intervention leading to Emily's career opportunity. Do you think this kind of networking through chance encounters really happens, or was it too coincidental for the story? Emily's transformation from someone who made herself smaller so others could shine to someone who claimed her own worth. What moment in the story do you think was the real turning point for her? Drop your answers in the comments. I love hearing different perspectives on character choices and whether you think the characters' decisions were realistic or idealized. Also, what topics would you like to see explored in future stories? Workplace dynamics? Dating after major life changes? More family drama? Let me know.